That sound, the rumble of a truck on the highway.
Yeah.
It really does feel like the heartbeat of the American economy.
It's constant, isn't it? Everywhere.
Exactly. Every time you hear a train whistle or you see a plane way up there or just notice that semi next to you, you're seeing this incredible volume of stuff and people just moving.
It's the whole system that gets, well, everything you consume or wear or use from wherever it starts to wherever it ends up.
Right. Connects people for work, for fun. But here's the big question we want to tackle today. Can looking really closely at all that motion, the state of our roads and rails and ports, and how much demand there is, can that actually tell us something fundamental about the economy's health?
Like, is transportation some kind of hidden economic bellwether?
Exactly. Is it a shortcut to understanding what's going on?
It's a really powerful idea, thinking of it like the economy's circulatory system.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
If the blood, so to speak, is flowing strong, reaching everywhere, maybe the economy is healthy.
But if you see blockages or weak pulses, maybe slow flow, does that signal stress or shifts happening underneath?
Precisely. And that potential connection, that's what we're really digging into today.
Okay, so what do we got to work with?
We've pulled insights from a couple of key places. First, a specific look at trucking demand trends, focusing on the food sector from the Food Institute. That gives us a kind of ground level view.
Okay, a specific industry snapshot.
And then we've got a really comprehensive annual report from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, the BTS. It covers statistics across pretty much all modes of U.S. transportation. Super detailed.
Right, the big picture view. So our mission today
is basically to unpack all this data, try to pinpoint the most telling signals hidden in there.
And see what the transportation sector might be telling us, maybe whispering, maybe shouting about the current economic climate.
Yeah, can we actually use these stats to get a better handle on things? Let's dive in.
Okay, first things first. Let's just establish the scale here. Transportation isn't just some minor part of the economy, right?
Oh, not at all. It's massive. Absolutely fundamental. The numbers are pretty stark.
Give us the headline figure.
Okay, according to that BTS data, the transportation and warehousing sector, it accounted for 9.0% of U.S. gross domestic product, GDP, back in 2022.
9%. Wow.
And what's interesting is that's actually up quite a bit from the previous couple of years. It was 8.4% in 2021.
And 2020 was lower, I assume, because of the pandemic.
Right. It dipped to 7.7% in 2020. So you see it bouncing back and even growing its share. It's not just a support function. It's a huge and growing part of the total economic output.
So nearly a tenth of the economy. And it makes sense logically that if this sector is busy, it means other parts of the economy must be busy too.
That's the core idea behind the bellwether concept, yeah. The demand for transportation services, moving goods, moving people, it's seen as a direct, almost real-time reflection of production, consumption, overall business activity.
Every time you buy something online, every time raw materials go to a factory.
Exactly, or someone travels for a business meeting. All of that translates into needing a truck, a train, a plane, a ship. It's like the physical side of economic transactions.
And the sources mention the specific way to track the goods side of this, right? Something called the Freight TSI.
That's right. The Freight Transportation Services Index, or TSI. The BTS manages it.
What does it measure exactly?
It's designed to track the month-to-month changes in the volume of freight moving across the U.S. network. It pulls together data from trucking, rail, waterways, air cargo, pipelines.
So like a combined meter for how much stuff is moving?
Pretty much, yeah. A consolidated gauge of the flow of goods.
Okay, so what's that meter been showing lately? Is the flow speeding up or slowing down?
Well, this is where we get a really interesting and maybe slightly ambiguous signal.
Uh-oh. Not straightforward.
Not entirely. The data shows that the Freight TSI, after they smooth it out and adjust for trends, it actually began a downward trend after May 2022.
Downward trend. Okay, so less freight moving. That sounds like a slowdown signal.
That's the initial instinct, right? It fits that bellwether story perfectly. A decline in freight must mean the economy's cooling off.
But you said ambiguous.
Yes, because the report itself flags this, but adds a really important note of caution.
Which is?
The BTS explicitly says that while this downward trend possibly indicates an economic slowdown, they hesitate to call it definitively because there just isn't enough data accumulated since May 2022 to be absolutely certain.
Ah, okay. So it's a potential signal, but not confirmed yet.
Exactly. Economic data often has lags, revisions. You need a longer view to know if a dip is a real trend or just, noise. So this key index isn't flashing bright red. It's more like a yellow, keep an eye on this light.
The uncertainty itself is kind of the point here.
It really is. An ambiguous signal from a major indicator tells you something too. It tells you things might be shifting, but it's not a clear-cut picture yet.
And I guess different industries use transportation differently, right? That must affect demand.
Absolutely. Take the wholesale and retail trade sector. The report points out that back in 2021, they needed more transportation per dollar of their output than any other sector.
Makes sense. Moving finished goods to stores or homes.
Right. It's incredibly transport intensive compared to, say, a financial services company. So shifts in which parts of the economy are growing or shrinking will change the overall demand for transportation.
Okay, so transportation is huge. A key freight index dipped cautiously. Let's really zero in on moving goods now. Freight trends, that feels like the most direct pulse.
It really does. And in the U.S., when you talk freight, you have to talk trucking. It just dominates.
How dominant are we talking?
The numbers are frankly staggering. In 2022, trucks moved 12.6 billion tons of cargo.
Billion with a B.
Yes. Just try to picture that volume. It's about 64.5%, almost two-thirds of the total freight weight moved in the entire country.
Wow. Okay, two-thirds of the weight. What about the value? Probably even higher.
Spot on. Value-wise, trucking carried over $13.6 trillion worth of goods in 2022. That's 72.5% of the total freight value.
Over 70%.
Yeah. And just for comparison, the volume moved by trucks was about 8.1 times higher than what rail moved in 2022.
8 times more than rail. Okay, so trucking is absolutely the backbone.
No question. It's the artery of the supply chain.
Which means if the economy is changing gears, you'd expect to see it hit trucking first, or most clearly.
You'd think so. And that Food Institute source gives us a really concrete ground-level example from the produce sector.
Right. What did that show?
It quoted Dean Croak from Deep Freight and Analytics, who watches this stuff closely. He mentioned that while things were picking up in produce trucking, it was only after a really late start to the season.
Okay, late start. How late?
He specifically said that volume coming out of California as of mid-May was down 20% compared to normal for that time.
20% down. That's huge.
It translated to about 5,000 fewer truckloads just from California produce in that period.
5,000 fewer trucks.
Yeah.
Any reason given for that specific dip?
Yeah, Croak pointed to weather volatility. California had drought the previous year, then major flooding this year.
Right, whipsawing conditions.
Exactly. It messed up planting and harvesting schedules, basically forcing growers to try and squeeze a normal 24-week production season into maybe 22 weeks.
So a late start, then maybe a rush, uneven flow.
Seems like it. That dip might have reflected that initial disruption.
Okay, so weather messed with the supply side locally. But what about the trucking cost? Did the rates jump when volume eventually picked up?
This is where it gets really interesting and tells us something broader.
Cool.
Even though the produce volume was picking up after that delay, Croak noted that the overall trucking rates for both refrigerated trucks carrying produce and regular dry vans were actually, quote, depressed.
Depressed, lower rates. But if volume was picking up, that sounds backward.
It does seem counterintuitive at first glance. He mentioned that even though refrigerated rates usually spike around the 4th of July holiday, the general rate environment was still pretty favorable for the growers and shippers booking the trucks.
Favorable for shippers means lower costs for them. Why would rates be low if things are moving?
This is the key insight he offered. He said it's because, quote, there are still a lot of trucks in the market chasing loads.
Oversupply of trucks.
Exactly. It suggests that the capacity, the number of trucks and drivers available nationwide, is currently higher than the overall demand for moving freight across all industries.
So even if produce had a temporary surge after its delay,
the broader market for trucking services wasn't strong enough to push rates up overall. Trucking companies were still competing hard for whatever freight was out there.
So growers might face higher produce prices due to the weather, but they get a break on shipping costs because the trucking market is soft.
Precisely. That oversupply of trucking capacity reflected in those lower rates is a pretty strong signal about the general demand for goods movement. It kind of mirrors the ambiguity we saw in the freight TSI, doesn't it? A potential sign of softness.
That's a fantastic example of how the micro connects to the macro. Okay, trucking is dominant, showing some softness in rates, maybe overall volume, complicated by weather and capacity. What about other freight modes? Pipelines.
Pipelines are crucial, especially for energy. They moved 3.9 billion tons in 2022, which is nearly 20% of the total freight weight.
Mostly oil and gas.
Yep. Crude oil, refined fuels, hazardous liquids too. And the network is huge and growing over 230,000 miles of those liquid pipelines in 2021, up 26% since 2010.
How did they fare through the pandemic and recovery?
Shipments dipped about 10% in 2020, but they bounced back pretty well in 2021, hitting 3.4 billion barrels. Still a little shy of the 2019 peak of 3.7 billion barrels, but showing recovery alongside energy demand.
And rail freight. We see those long trains all the time.
Absolutely critical, especially for bulk stuff like coal, grain, chemicals, and also those stacked intermodal containers.
And they manage their own tracks mostly, right?
Yeah, the big freight railroads are responsible for maintaining their vast networks, tracks, bridges, signals. The report highlights that this infrastructure is constantly battling wear and tear, weather, requires huge ongoing investment from the railroads themselves.
Does the report give recent volume trends for rail like it does for trucking?
The BTS report we looked at focused more on the system overview, infrastructure condition, and safety aspects for rail, rather than digging deep into recent month-to-month volume trends in the same way it did for, say, the TSI or trucking examples. Still vital, just less trend detail in these specific sources.
Gotcha. Okay, what about water? Ports and waterways. Huge for international trade.
Definitely the gateways for global commerce. The U.S. has something like 8,300 water transport facilities, and there's been a really significant shift happening with container cargo coming from Asia.
A shift? How so?
Get this. For the first time in 2022, East Coast ports actually handled more import tonnage from Asia than West Coast ports did.
Really? East Coast beat the West Coast. That seems like a big deal.
It is. East Coast ports took in 70.2 billion metric tons of imports, while the West Coast handled 63.2 billion.
Why the change? Was it the West Coast port congestion we heard so much about?
That's likely a huge factor. Those massive backlogs during the pandemic peak probably pushed a lot of shippers to find alternative routes through the East and Gulf coasts.
Makes sense. Diversifying risk.
Plus, ongoing labor negotiations on the West Coast might have played a role. And even things like drought affecting the Panama Canal lower water levels mean ships can't load as heavily, which changes the math on routing. Shippers might be prioritizing reliability over the potentially shorter, but maybe riskier, West Coast route now.
So a strategic realignment of supply chains hitting U.S. shores. What about exports?
Interestingly, the report notes that both coasts saw a decline in export volumes since the main COVID year of 2020.
Fewer U.S. goods going out. Could be global demand, could be getting stuff to the ports.
Yeah, it could be a mix of factors, logistics challenges on the outbound side, or shifts in what the world wants to buy from the U.S.
And inland waterways, barges on rivers.
Still very important for bulk goods. The report mentions delays at locks, those elevators for barges. The average delay in 2020 was about 172 minutes.
Almost 3 hours waiting at a lock.
Yeah, it was actually down from over 4 hours in 2019, maybe less traffic in 2020, but still a significant chunk of time. And we shouldn't forget ferries, vital locally, 112 million passengers, 26 million vehicles back in 2019, mostly in places like New York and Washington State.
Okay, before we leave freight, e-commerce. It feels like it's changed everything, especially that last bit of the journey.
Oh, completely. A total game changer for the last mile.
Getting packages from the local warehouse to my doorstep.
Exactly. While that explosive pandemic growth may be leveled off a bit in 2022, the underlying impact is still enormous. Just think about how many delivery vans you see driving around your neighborhood now compared to 5 or 10 years ago.
It's constant.
And it creates new headaches, right? Congestion in residential areas, finding places to park, efficiency, leading to things like package lockers, maybe alternative delivery vehicles down the road.
But tracking this massive shift, is the data keeping up?
That's a major point the BTS report makes. It specifically calls out the scarcity of good analyzable data on e-commerce logistics and its transportation footprint.
Why is it so hard to track?
Well, it's relatively new, it's incredibly fragmented with lots of players, and it doesn't fit neatly into the traditional ways we measure freight, like tracking truckloads or containers. Analysts often have to rely on estimations, models, comparing bits of data.
Because we don't have solid numbers on all those vans going house to house.
Pretty much. That lack of clear data on the last mile makes it harder to get a complete picture of the whole transportation sector, and definitely harder to use it as a perfect bellwether when such a big chunk of goods movement is happening in this less visible way.
Okay, so freight. Some potentially cautious signals from the TSI and trucking rates, big strategic shifts at ports, but clouded by data gaps, especially in e-commerce. Let's totally shift gears now. Moving people. Passenger travel. What does that tell us about the economy?
Passenger travel tends to reflect different things. Consumer confidence for vacations, job patterns for commuting, business activity for corporate trips.
But the pandemic just threw all the old patterns out the window, didn't it?
Completely. Especially with how and where people work now, and the recovery since then has been really uneven across different ways of traveling.
Okay, break it down for us. Who recovered fastest?
Highway travel, personal cars. That bounced back quickest.
Yeah.
The data shows it basically got back to 2019 levels by November 2021.
So people got back in their cars pretty fast.
Yeah, and it stayed around that 2019 level through most of 2022.
What about flying? Airports certainly seem packed sometimes.
Air travel definitely saw a strong recovery. Now, the report mentions hitting parity on some metrics by September 2022, but if you look at the total number of passengers flying on U.S. airlines for the whole year, it was 847 million in 2022. That sounds like a lot, but it was still way below the 1.06 billion passengers they carried in 2019.
Still a pretty big gap in 2022 then.
Yeah, and fewer total flights too, partly because airlines were using bigger planes. But looking beyond that report's time frame, more recent data from TSA screenings in 2023 suggests passenger numbers were getting much closer to or even exceeding 2019 levels at times. So the recovery definitely continued strongly after 2022.
Okay, air recovering strongly, but maybe not quite fully back in 22 numbers. What about long-distance trains like Amtrak?
Amtrak also saw a huge jump from the pandemic lows. They went from only 12 million passengers in 2021 up to 23 million in 2022.
Doubled almost.
Yeah, big resurgence. But again, compare it to pre-pandemic, that 23 million was still only about 70% of the 32 million passengers Amtrak carried in 2019.
Still catching up then.
Right. And like air recovery kept going. Ridership was up 18% in the third quarter of 2023 compared to 2022, growing, but not all the way back yet.
And the story for city buses and subways is different.
Sadly, yes. That's the real outlier. Urban transit systems have not bounced back like the others. Ridership is still hovering around only 2/3, maybe 65–70% of what it was in 2019.
Just stuck at that lower level.
Pretty much. And the main reason everyone points to is the massive shift in work habits.
Which brings us squarely to telework and hybrid work. That feels like the biggest single change to passenger movement.
It's been absolutely revolutionary for travel patterns. Think about the daily commute.
Driving alone to work.
Yeah, the main way people got to work pre-pandemic, that lost 14.5 million drivers in 2020.
14.5 million fewer solo commuters. Wow.
By 2022, maybe 6 million of those had come back to driving alone, but that still left commuting numbers about 9 million drivers short of the 2019 level.
9 million fewer daily commutes just from solo drivers. Where did they go?
A lot of them went home. The percentage working from home just exploded. One survey, the ACS, showed somewhere between 10% and 21% of workers across different racial groups working from home in 2022.
That's a big chunk.
Another survey, the CPS, painted an even starker picture. It estimated about 27.5 million people did some work from home. And get this, 11.5 million of those, which was 42% of the workers they surveyed, reported working from home full-time.
42% working fully remote in that survey. That fundamentally changes traffic.
Absolutely. And we saw the effect, at least early on. In 2021, there were big gains in people having shorter commutes, under 20 minutes, fewer cars on the road.
Made sense. But did that last?
The 2022 data showed things sliding back a bit towards longer, more congested commutes. Maybe more people returned part-time or traffic patterns just readjusted. Some of those early gains seem to fade.
Okay, so the commute is transformed. What about longer trips? International travel. That's a big economic driver too.
International travel is another area showing strong recovery, but again, not quite back to 2019 numbers yet, at least based on the 2022 data.
How far off were we?
Visitor arrivals to the U.S. jumped massively from only 22 million in 2021 to almost 51 million in 2022.
Huge jump.
But still down 36% compared to the nearly 80 million visitors we had in 2019.
And Americans traveling abroad.
Similar story. Departures went up 66% in 2022 compared to 2021, reaching 81 million. But that was still 19% below the 99 million departures in 2019.
So lots more movement, but still a gap. Does it vary by country?
Oh, significantly. The report points out Canada, for instance. Arrivals from Canada just cratered during the pandemic from nearly 21 million in 2019 down to 2.5 million in 2021.
Wow.
It bounced back to 14.6 million in 2022, but still way below 2019. Mexico, on the other hand, dropped less severely and recovered stronger, actually having more arrivals than Canada in 2020 and 2021.
So international recovery is really a bunch of different stories.
Exactly. Depends heavily on where people are coming from or going to.
Hey, passenger travel is a real mixed bag then. Highway air, strong recovery, but maybe not fully back in 22 volume. Rail catching up, transit way down, all shaped by telework. How does this show up in what people spend on transportation?
That's another interesting angle. Consumer spending on transportation as a share of all their spending was around 17% in 2022.
17%. How does that compare?
Well, the actual dollar amount spent in 2022 slightly edged past the 2019 level, so people were spending a bit more in total. But historically, that share used to be higher, maybe 18, 19% earlier in the 2000s. It dipped during the pandemic and hasn't quite climbed back to that historical proportion of the household budget.
Interesting. Does spending vary a lot by income?
Oh, yeah. Total transport spending per person definitely goes up with income. Higher earners spend more overall.
But
the report highlights a cool nuance. If you look at spending per worker in the household, total transportation spending kind of levels out across different income groups.
meaning people who work generally need to spend a certain amount on transport, regardless of income.
Seems to suggest that, yeah, a baseline need.
Any other income patterns pop out?
Yeah, a couple. Spending on gas per vehicle is actually pretty similar across income levels, only creeping up slightly for higher earners. Suggests fuel costs hit everyone relatively similarly once they own a car.
Okay.
But purchased travel like flights, cruises, that spending was mostly stable per worker except for big jumps in the top two income brackets in 2022.
So higher earners drove the recovery in discretionary travel spending.
Looks that way based on this data. And for local stuff like transit or taxis, total spending is relatively stable across groups, but there's an equity point. On a per-worker basis, the lowest income group actually spends the most on transit.
Showing higher reliance for essential trips.
Exactly.
Okay, so passenger data. Less of a clear economic signal right now because of the huge telework disruption, but spending patterns give clues about recovery and reliance. Let's talk about the physical system itself. Infrastructure. Roads, bridges. Does their condition tell us something? Maybe a longer-term signal?
Absolutely. The state of the network directly hits efficiency, reliability, costs. Bad roads, slow trucks, crumbling bridges cause detours.
What does the BTS report say about condition? How are our roads holding up?
It tracks things like pavement condition over time, showing percentages of poor pavement on major highways. For bridges, the overall condition has actually continued to improve gradually.
Well, that's good news.
It is, but we need to understand the terms. When a bridge is called functionally obsolete or structurally deficient, it doesn't automatically mean it's unsafe to drive on today.
Okay.
It means it needs major maintenance, repairs, or maybe replacement soon. It might have lanes that are too narrow or weight limits, issues that indicate it's not up to modern standards or is deteriorating.
Gotcha. And how much traffic uses these less than ideal bridges?
That's the striking part. The report noted that in 2021, just 9.4% of bridges classified this way carried a whopping 45.5% of all vehicle traffic crossing bridges.
Wow, nearly half the bridge traffic is on bridges flagged as needing significant work.
Yeah. It highlights a potential bottleneck or constraint on future economic efficiency if those aren't addressed.
That really puts it in perspective. And traffic jams, congestion, that's a direct economic drain too.
Huge drain, costs time and fuel. The report estimated truck congestion alone cost $11 billion in 2020.
$11 billion just for trucks stuck in traffic.
You know, that was actually down from $20 billion in 2019, probably because overall traffic was lighter in 2020.
Right, pandemic effect.
But interestingly, the truck's share of that total congestion cost actually went up slightly, from 11% to 12%. Suggests they were still hit hard, maybe disproportionately.
And are the worst spots getting any better?
Doesn't sound like it generally. The report mentions persistent bottlenecks. Places like Fort Lee in New Jersey, parts of Atlanta, Nashville have stayed pretty consistently bad for the last decade.
Just chronic choke points.
Yeah. And the average peak hour speed for trucks going through the top 100 worst bottlenecks was only 36.3 miles per hour in 2022. And that was actually down 6% from 2021.
Getting slower in the worst spots. That's not good for supply chains.
Definitely a negative signal for efficiency.
What about rail and waterway infrastructure?
Well, for rail, freight railroads maintain their own tracks, as we said. Amtrak operates over about 21,000 route miles. For ports and inland waterways, the report suggests the core physical infrastructure, like dams and locks, hasn't changed dramatically in the last decade or so.
But now there's this huge influx of government money coming, right? The bipartisan infrastructure law.
That's the massive overlay here. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, it's pumping significant federal funds into transportation.
Like how much?
The report gives examples like $22 billion specifically for Amtrak capital projects, new trains, and $44 billion for the Federal Railroad Administration to distribute through grants. Billions more for roads, bridges, ports.
So that's not an immediate economic signal about the current cycle.
Right. It's more of a long-term investment in future capacity and efficiency. It's the government acknowledging that the state of repair needs serious attention for future economic growth. It's shaping the future bellwether, perhaps.
Infrastructure is more of a long game. What about day-to-day operations?
Yeah.
Safety, sustainability, technology. Do these tell us anything?
They definitely speak to the overall health and direction of the system. Safety is obviously critical, and the stats are pretty sobering.
What's the headline?
Highway crashes are just overwhelmingly where the danger lies. In 2021, motor vehicles on roads accounted for 95.5% of all U.S. transportation fatalities.
95%.
And 99.5% of all transportation-related injuries. It's almost entirely a road safety problem in terms of numbers.
Just staggering. What are the main causes?
The sources consistently point to driver behavior. Speeding, DUI, not yielding, just general carelessness for passenger cars. For big trucks, speeding, distraction, and impairment are key factors.
Impairment seems like a persistent issue.
Very much so. The report mentioned a study from 2016 looking at drivers killed in crashes who were tested. About 44% tested positive for drugs, 38% for alcohol, and many had multiple substances. It's a huge ongoing challenge.
What about safety on transit or other modes?
Transit safety is also a concern mentioned. While the numbers are much lower than highways, the report noted an increase in murders on transit between 2019 and 2020, and another analysis suggested assaults on transit workers had tripled since 2008.
Worrying trend for workers and riders.
Yeah. On the tech side, autonomous vehicle development is progressing rapidly. Testing data from California, for example, showed huge improvements. The average distance driven before a human had to intervene went from just 14 miles in 2018 up to 726 miles in 2022.
Huge leap in capability.
Definitely. And there are safety programs using confidential reporting, like Safe MTS for ships and Safe OCS for offshore drilling, trying to learn from near misses.
Okay, technology is advancing. What about sustainability? Energy use. That feels critical for the future.
It's a massive challenge. The report really underscores how dependent U.S. transportation still is on petroleum.
How dependent?
In 2022, nearly 90%, 89.4% of all energy used by transportation came from petroleum, gasoline, diesel.
Almost 90% still. Wow.
Yeah. The report does note that's actually the lowest percentage since 1953, so there's been a very, very slow shift over decades. But fossil fuels are still overwhelmingly dominant.
Put that energy use in context for us.
Get this comparison. The report notes that the energy consumed just by the U.S. transportation sector is higher than the total petroleum consumption of the entire economies of China and India combined.
Wait, our transport uses more petroleum than all of China uses and all of India uses combined?
Based on the implicit comparison of the figures cited,
Yeah.
It just highlights the immense scale of our transport energy thirst.
That's mind-blowing. So transitioning away is a monumental task.
Monumental.
Yeah.
But it is happening, slowly. The report mentions rising sales of EVs and hybrids, falling battery costs, government incentives like the Inflation Reduction Act helping things along.
What about other fuels?
Natural gas plays a role, but mostly in heavy trucks and buses, they accounted for 97% of natural gas use in vehicles in 2022.
Despite that oil dependence, are there any positive environmental trends?
Yes, definitely on air quality from tailpipes. Because of much stricter vehicle emissions standards over the years, the amount of pollution coming out per mile driven has dropped over 85% between 2000 and 2022.
That's a huge improvement.
It's a real success story for regulation driving cleaner tech. But challenges remain, like particle pollution from tire and brake wear, which isn't covered by tailpipe rules. And there are other issues like noise, animal collisions, fuel tank leaks.
And with the shift to EVs, is tracking energy use straightforward?
Another major data gap the report flags. It's really hard to track EV energy use accurately, especially home charging.
Why is that?
Because when you charge your EV at home, that electricity just gets counted as part of your house's regular residential energy consumption in the big government statistics. It doesn't get tagged as transportation energy.
So we don't have a clear picture of how much electricity the EV fleet is actually using.
Or not easily know. It makes it tough to track the transition, understand charging patterns, plan grid upgrades. It's a significant blind spot.
Okay, so operations show progress in some areas like emissions, but huge challenges remain with safety and fossil fuel reliance, plus this key data gap on EV energy. This seems to point to a bigger theme the report addresses: the difficulty in getting a complete picture, the data gaps themselves.
This is absolutely crucial for our bellwether question. The BTS is legally required by Congress to collect stats on the system's safety, condition, connectivity, efficiency. All these key aspects.
Right.
But the reality is the data collection system hasn't always kept pace with how fast transportation is changing.
What are the biggest blind spots the report identified? Where are we flying partially blind?
Several key areas, really understanding the full impact of telework and hybrid work, how it changes travel patterns, not just overall, but by time of day, day of week, impact on congestion that's still hard to nail down precisely.
Okay, the nuances of remote work's impact.
Another one is measuring local travel by people who aren't local residents. Tourists, people passing through, they use local roads in transit, but tracking that specific demand is tricky.
And you mentioned e-commerce data before.
Yes, that's a huge one. Getting comprehensive data on how all those packages are moving, especially in the last mile, and the impact on traffic, infrastructure, it's still really scarce.
And the EV charging data gap you just mentioned?
Right. Accurate, reliable data on EV energy use and charging behavior is missing.
Any other modes lacking good data?
Yeah, the report mentions needing better coverage and usage data for different kinds of bus services. Local transit, yes, but also inner-city buses like Greyhound and charter buses. Their role isn't always fully captured.
And those scooters and shared bikes everywhere.
Micromobility, yeah. Data on availability and actual use is often spotty, even though they're a growing part of the urban mix. Even for traditional transit, getting timely financial data spending and revenue has been a challenge, though a new program starting in 2024 aims to fix that.
So lots of newer or less traditional modes are hard to track, and even some established ones have data timeliness issues.
Pretty much. Shared services like Uber, Lyft, bike share programs also flagged as needing better data. And all these gaps mean that when we try to look at the transportation sector as a whole or use it as a bellwether,
We're working with an incomplete picture.
necessarily, yes.
Are things being done to try and fill these holes? Improve the data?
Yes, thankfully. The report mentions several efforts. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act, for example, mandates collecting data on how long containers sit outside ports, a key efficiency metric.
Okay.
There's an initiative called FLOW Freight Logistics Optimization Works, where companies and the government are trying to share confidential supply chain data enabled by laws that protect that sensitive info to get better visibility.
Using data sharing to see the whole chain better.
Exactly. Plus, ongoing programs focused on port statistics, cross-border freight, efforts like the Transportation Satellite Account try to better measure transportation's economic contribution overall. So work is being done, but it takes time.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot. The sector's huge scale, the tricky signals from freight, the massive shifts in passenger travel due to telework, infrastructure needs, operational issues like safety and energy, and these really significant data gaps. Let's try to pull it all together. Back to the core question. Based on all this, how good is transportation as an economic bellwether today?
Well, synthesizing everything, the picture that emerges is complex. It's not the simple, clear crystal ball you might hope for.
Not a perfect predictor then.
Probably not perfect, no. But certain parts seem more indicative than others. The freight side, things like that freight TSI index, the details we got on trucking volume, and especially those depressed rates, maybe even those big strategic port shifts.
Yeah.
Those seem to offer the more direct signals about what's happening with economic activity right now. They're tightly linked to making stuff, moving stuff, buying stuff.
And the signals there were leaning
Cautious.
cautious, yes. That downward drift in the TSI since mid-2022, plus the trucking rate softness suggesting overcapacity. It does lend some weight to the idea that the good side of the economy was maybe slowing or plateauing in the period covered.
But with caveats, right? The ambiguity of the TSI, specific factors like weather.
Exactly. Not a slam dunk signal, but suggestive.
Okay, what about the passenger side? Is that telling us much about the economy? Based on these sources, passenger travel feels like a much less clear-cut economic bellwether at this moment.
Why? Because people are still traveling.
They are, but the patterns are so heavily dominated by these huge, maybe permanent behavioral shifts from the pandemic, especially telework.
So the fact that transit is down and highway travel is up tells us more about lifestyle changes than the economy itself.
Largely, yes. It tells us how people are adapting to new ways of living and working more than it reflects the traditional economic pulse of commutes and business trips as they used to be. It's more about adaptation than just economic strength or weakness right now, although spending patterns give some clues.
And things like infrastructure conditions, safety, sustainability.
Infrastructure and the big IIJA investments are definitely crucial for long-term economic health and capacity, but they don't really signal the immediate ups and downs of the business cycle.
Right, long-term versus short-term.
And safety, sustainability, technology. They're about the system's evolution and quality, not really short-term economic forecasting tools.
And looming over all of it.
Those data gaps we just talked about.
Right. Can't ignore those.
Absolutely not. The fact that we have incomplete pictures of e-commerce, EV energy use, even detailed local travel, it inherently limits how perfectly reliable the entire sector can be as a bellwether. It gives us strong clues, especially from freight, but you have to read them carefully, knowing there are blind spots.
So valuable signals, but interpret with caution.
That's a good way to put it. It's a useful gauge, maybe even essential, but it's not a flawless oracle.
Okay, so wrapping up. Transportation, undeniably vital. Freight activity, particularly trucking and the TSI, offers some intriguing, if complex, signals potentially pointing towards caution in the goods economy. Passenger travel, massively reshaped by telework, is a less clear economic signal currently. And significant data gaps mean our understanding is still catching up.
That sums it up pretty well.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Given these profound shifts, e-commerce changing how goods move, telework changing how people move or don't, is the whole idea of transportation as a traditional bellwether itself changing?
That's the provocative question, isn't it? As the system fundamentally adapts, do the old signals mean the same thing?
And what new metrics, maybe related to those areas where data is currently weak, might become the really important indicators to watch in the future? Maybe tracking last-mile delivery efficiency or EV charging patterns.
It's fascinating to consider what the future bellwethers might be as the system evolves.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of U.S. transportation data.
Hope it gives you, the listener, a new lens to look through.
Yeah, the next time you hear that truck rumbling by or a train whistle or see a plane overhead,
maybe think of it not just as a vehicle getting somewhere, but as one small part of this vast, complex system sending subtle signals about the economy we all live in.
Thanks for listening. Join us again for the next deep dive.